we're fascinated by that idea that there'll be a pathogen that kills everybody. The first science fiction book is Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which imagines a version of the plague that kills everybody except one dude who you'd have enjoyed that. You'd have been fine. If it had been you, be like,
I haven't had,
all,
to be honest,
all those assholes have gone.
I haven't had the best luck with viruses. Let's just say. Let me just point that out. So
Actually, you have had the best luck because
I'm alive.
I mean,
yeah.
I remember when you told me you had HIV. I thought, oh God, there goes one of my best friends, and you're still alive. And that is the good news.
I'm like Trump. I'm like a kitchen roach. It can't be destroyed. It's like my mother, actually. She's 85 and should have, incredibly vulnerable, but still hanging on. But that's, I'm going to push back on this a little bit. I mean, when I think, for example, you're living in Europe in 536 AD, which is a pretty awful year, when these massive volcanic explosions happen, I think in Alaska. You have no idea what's going on. The sky turns dark. There is almost a year on planet Earth in which no one really gets daylight. The crops fail. Famine happens. You talk about famine quite a lot in the book. That must have felt, and indeed was for many, many people, certainly at the time, who believed that was the end of the world. And what I would argue is that it kind of was. Now, we know that the Dark Age is a bit of a myth, obviously, that the Roman Empire was already in very fast decline. But when you just look at economic activity, even cultural and social activity, it was almost a 1,000 years before civilization in Europe got enough mojo back and enough population back to begin to re-energize. That is a long time. And surely that has humankind has some kind of memory of these disasters that keeps that imagination alive.
Yes, and I think that's why they're kind of embedded in the great religions. Because when you're caught up in a big disaster, even if it's a relatively local one, like some spectacular fire, or a huge flood. What strikes me in many accounts of such disasters is that how often people say it felt like it was the end of the world. There's one of the, I think it's Pliny the Younger's description of Vesuvius is, well, as it was all happening, I thought, well, it's the end of the world. Well, it wasn't. It was just a volcanic eruption in a part of Italy. But I think that sense that one's witnessed the end of the world is quite common when people experience even a localized disaster. And that is why we have a keen sense of what the end of the world ought to be like. There'll be a lot of fire, or there'll be a terrible disease,
or a flood.
All the thing. And everything will be washed away. We've seen the trailer, right? There are lots and lots of sort of small versions of the end of the world that one can experience or read about or see in a movie. So we have a sense of what that would be like if it was on a global scale. But I think what's obviously crucial about human history is that that even when we went to work with all the capabilities of industrial weaponry, not once, but twice in the 20th century, and unleashed multi-million strong armies against one another with the express purpose of dealing death and destruction. Even then, we didn't come close to killing even as large a fraction of humanity as the Black Death did, and that was only about a third. So that for me is the critical point, that it's actually quite hard to imagine something that would be full-scale extinction. Though of course it is within the bounds of possibility. And for example, if you had a really massive level of volcanic activity, which we've forgotten about because there hasn't been a really big volcano since 1815, there is a sense in which you could get to the kind of extinction level where life on Earth would actually be impossibly difficult to sustain. So I'm not saying doom is non-existent. I'm just saying that it's very low probability that we'd actually be completely wiped out. And the reality, therefore, is that we have to grapple with something much more modest than that. And a good example of this is how we talk about climate change, because it's very clear that average temperatures are rising. We haven't figured out how to stop them rising because we haven't figured out how to constrain China. And this future that people talk about a lot, many bad things will happen, but it won't be the end of the world, not literally.